Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry, and cult babes, today I've got the baby blues. And I'm not talking about these peepers, okay? Last weekend, when I definitely should have been doing literally anything else, like cleaning out the fridge or replying to texts that I've been dodging since, August, I fell into this deep, sad rabbit hole of black market adoption stories and those teary parent-kid reunion clips that you would see on old episodes of Unsolved Mysteries or Oprah. And why my brain picked that as the weekend vibe, no idea. But I was locked in, just scrolling. And imagine, you're on your couch, it's a normal night, about to crack open a Diet Coke, and Unsolved Mysteries comes on, and that creepy synth music starts up. Robert Stack is like, tonight, a mystery that has haunted families for decades. And you're gearing up for some haunted barn situation, right? But nope. It cuts to a segment about stolen babies, and then you recognize someone. Not like, oh, she looks kind of familiar. Not, wait, isn't that your friend's cousin's neighbor? No, you know her. Like full body, your hair's standing up, know her. Because she's the woman who stole your baby. Imagine. Well, that's basically what happened to this woman named Alma Sipple back in 1989. She's sitting there, she's watching TV, minding her business, and then the segment starts and she just freezes in shock because on the screen is a woman she met one single time, but could never forget. It was burned into her memory. It was in a Memphis hospital room back in 1946. Alma was young at the time and had just had her baby. She was in that wrecked postpartum haze where everything feels loud and bright and unreal and you're barely even in your body. Or so I'm told. She's at her most vulnerable. This older woman comes in with a calm, confident, all authoritative vibe and tells Alma, listen, I'm going to take your newborn daughter, okay? I need to take her for medical care. Once Alma was more coherent and started asking questions, the hospital told her the baby had passed away from pneumonia and was already buried. No viewing, no goodbye, just that flat, cold explanation. Alma was understandably devastated. She carried that grief, guilt, and confusion with her for decades. But seeing that woman's face again gave her a reason to question everything. It made her go, wait, if she's involved with stealing babies, what actually happened to mine all those years ago? What if my baby didn't die of pneumonia? And she was right to question it. A volunteer group like old school investigators doing this kind of thing way before the internet made it easy, eventually connected the dots and found Alma's daughter. She was alive, grown up, and living as Sandra. More than 40 years after that hospital room moment, they finally got to meet again and reunite. Another story I saw in a clip from 60 Minutes was very similar. A woman named Mary Reed. She was young, unmarried, and had just given birth in 1943. She was still halfway sedated when the nurses brought her what they called routine papers and told her to sign. And she's thinking, okay, hospital paperwork, whatever, a birth certificate, or I don't know, some boring administrative thing. She didn't even think that she had a choice. It felt like, this is what I'm being told to do. I'm being asked to sign this document. I better sign it. Little did she know she was signing away her baby. That's exactly what happened. The investigation said those routine papers were actually adoption documents, shoved in front of her while she was still groggy from the anesthesia. When Mary realized what had happened, she tried to get her son back, but she hit a wall immediately. The Tennessee Children's Home Society basically shut her out completely. They offered no records, no answers, no help, just straight up stonewalling. They erased the baby from her life before she even passed the placenta. Mary's son, later named Steve, grew up believing the story that his birth mom didn't want him and had given him up. Then almost 50 years later, he reads something about an adoption scandal and it's like a light bulb goes off in his head. The details all matched up. The timeline, everything, and suddenly it's not, was I abandoned anymore? It was, wait, was I kidnapped? God, I mean, that would send anyone into fucking orbit, right? It would take a lot less, let me tell you. But yeah, that is something that would absolutely just send me over the edge. He finds out he was taken and that his mom had been fighting to get him back the whole time. Their reunion starts with this phone call where Mary tells him that she's been waiting for that moment for her entire life. And when he flies out to meet her, the family greets him with a house full of yellow ribbons, which apparently is the whole symbol of hope and safe return of someone who's been gone. And I always thought that was just like a troops thing. So I don't know, learned something new. And then there was this awful Oprah episode in 1991, the year of your Lord and Savior, Spencer Henry, where she interviewed these twin brothers, James and Thomas White. They were older by then, and they told the whole story from the start. So apparently, one afternoon, when the twins were like 5, their 13-year-old sister was babysitting, and the boys were napping in their bed, and she popped out to go see their grandma, who I guess just lived down the road. Super normal, quick errand that she was running. She leaves them sleeping, and she comes back, and they're gone. I mean, just... I can't picture what that feels like. I can't imagine the fear that would enter your body. Like, strangers had walked into the house while they were asleep, picked both boys up out of their bed, and just disappeared with them. No warning, no noise, no clue, no ransom note, no evidence, no nothing. Just poof. Imagine coming home to that. Their poor sister. God, I just can't imagine. She must have carried so much guilt. The next thing the twins remembered is being taken to Memphis, to the Tennessee Children's Home Society. They didn't even know how long they were there. Everything was such a blur at this time. And then eventually they got shipped across the country and adopted by this wealthy couple in Hollywood. No explanations, no context, nothing. They just showed up in a totally new life, and they were supposed to act like none of it ever happened. Like, yeah, okay, cool. Just pretend we weren't literally stolen out of our beds. It's fucking insane. And then the abuse kicked in basically right away. They told Oprah that these rich adoptive parents always got drunk, they were always partying, and just got off on this power trip of hurting them. Like, whatever was closest, that's what they used. Total monsters. The boys said they got whipped with an ironing cord. They would be left alone for large periods of time and beaten so badly that even the neighbors couldn't ignore it anymore. Eventually, one night, they were like, no, okay, we're done. We can't do this anymore. 2 7-year-olds just decided to save themselves. They ran away and they hid in an empty swimming pool until a neighbor found them shaking, terrified, and covered in bruises and marks. The neighbor called the police. The cops documented everything. And instead of sending them back to their actual family, the authorities shipped them straight back to the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Like, what are we doing here? What's going on, people? What's this thought process? That's when they say the sexual abuse started. For years and years, the twins didn't talk about any of it, not even with each other. Like, apparently they only started really saying it out loud a few months before this interview on Oprah. But when they did, their memories lined up in the worst way. They both said they remembered being put on the floor with blankets and other kids, all of them naked. They remembered kids crying, screaming, adults threatening to shut up or else. They remembered different adults touching them and kissing them in ways that were clearly not okay. And they remembered being shoved into a big bed while people watched and being forced to hug and kiss each other because some grown-ups told them to. Just completely sick, evil, vile behavior. After that, the twins said they got moved around nonstop from home to home to home, like they were being loaned out for stretches of time. And they got renamed so many times that by the time they were grown, they joked they didn't even know what to call each other anymore, which is dark as hell. But also, what do you do with a situation like that other than laugh? It's horrifying. So what do these stories and thousands more like them have in common? One woman. And if you want to know how any of this was even possible, you've got to zoom way out. Before the headlines, before these reunions, before any of the people knew that they had been stolen. Back to where the whole mess started. So, okay, Cult Babes, drop yourself into early 1900s America for a second. Adoption back then wasn't really adoption the way we think of it now. Like, yeah, the idea existed, but it was barely a thing. Before the 1920s, even big-name charities were placing a laughably small number of kids a year. One survey said the Boston Children's Aid Society averaged like 5 placements a year. 5 total. And there wasn't any real structure holding any of it together. There was no consistent laws, no licensing, no state oversight, no standard rules, no solid paperwork. It was basically just vibes and, we'll sort it out later. Let's give these kids a place to sleep. Which, of course, meant that it was a vulnerable system, right? Ridiculously easy to exploit. Babies could get handed off with nothing more official than a handshake. Honestly, records, if anyone even kept them, were messy, random, and could be changed whenever somebody felt like it. Nobody had to check where a kid came from, whether the birth parents actually agreed, or if the new home was safe, none of it. So kids were getting passed around and basically disappearing into the chaos. And this is all happening during a time while society is being extra brutal about everything. Poverty is everywhere, right? New eugenics ideas are creeping into the culture. Single mothers are relentlessly shamed, pushed into maternity homes, and sometimes straight up hidden away from society. Poor families were labeled unfit, like it was some genetic defect. Orphanages were packed because raising kids was expensive and birth control wasn't really an option for most people. I mean, hell, we've had plenty of episodes over the years where we've talked about how certain kids growing up, their mom would die or something, and the dad's just like, I can't keep all of them. I'm going to put some of them in this orphanage over here and some over here. It's just crazy. This led to the orphanages overflowed with people, like mental hospitals at the time. And like I said, birth control was just not an option at the time. It wasn't like it is now. But then at a certain point in time, the vibe started shifting and parenthood got a little easier in some ways, okay? Formula was improving, infant mortality rates started to drop, and suddenly adoption got repackaged as this wholesome, patriotic, morally noble thing. And not just charity either. It became like, hey, you can build a better family this way. And yeah, that better usually meant good genes, which is gross, but true. By the mid-1920s, people wanted healthy white infants so badly that the demand exploded past supply. There just weren't enough available babies to match what people were trying to get. And when there's a gap that big, somebody with ambition, connections, and no good conscience is gonna fill it. And that somebody was Georgia Tann. Georgia didn't start out as a villain. She was born in 1891 in rural Mississippi, and her dad was Judge George Clark Tann. Super controlling, deep in politics, and very much the you will be perfect and you will obey me type of guy. He was obsessed with her becoming a pianist. She was like, nah, I think I want to be a lawyer one day. After a lot of pushing, he finally taught her law himself, and she did pass the Mississippi bar, which for a woman back then was wild. It was a very big deal. She was a real rarity. But even after that, he still wouldn't let her actually practice law. Like, congrats on passing the bar, babe. Now go practice your scales. So she pivots instead into something more acceptable for an unmarried woman at the time. Basically one of the only jobs that society was like, yeah, sure, that's ladylike enough. And that was social work. Okay, a little empathy here. She started working in different children's homes around Mississippi, and right away she was getting side-eyed for taking kids from poor families when there wasn't a real reason to, which should have been a screaming neon warning sign for future employers. But nope, they just quietly fired her. Didn't dig too deep into it. Didn't punish her. Not even a slap on the wrist, and she just hopped on to the next gig like nothing happened. And then sometime between 1922 and 1924, she bailed on Mississippi completely. She packed up Ann Atwood, who was her longtime partner, and a baby that she'd adopted, and they moved to Memphis. Her dad, doing what dads like that do, pulled some strings and got her a job at the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and she ended up as the executive secretary for the Shelby County branch. And that job handed her exactly what she needed for what came next. A legit title. Real power, baby. Easy access and basically a nonstop pipeline of kids who didn't have anybody in their corner. And she wasted no time. Almost as soon as she got there, she started rearranging the whole place. At first, she was kind of sneaky, and she'd use her new power to override intake calls, reassigning kids to different homes and messing with their birth records so it was way harder for birth families to figure out where their children had been sent off to. Just little moves that looked official on paper but made people disappear in real life. And then pretty soon, those little moves turned into a full-on takeover. Within a few years, she'd basically propositioned herself as the boss of the Memphis branch, and by 1929, she'd staged a straight-up power grab and promoted herself from executive secretary to executive director. And that's when the infamous Packard showed up. Those old school cars, you know? Driving Miss Georgia. She started rolling around Memphis in this chauffeured black Packard limo, which is honestly a ridiculous flex for somebody running a quote-unquote charity that was always claiming it was broke, by the way. But it wasn't just her being flashy. The car was part of her whole act. It made her look official and legitimate, even a little glam. They're like, oh, she's pulling up in a limo. She must be someone I can trust. Like, if you're a poor family, right, at the time, and somebody pulls up looking like the government itself, you're not going to argue with them. You're going to assume this person's official. You assume that they're untouchable. How am I to compete with this? This lady's in a limo. And while all of that was happening out front, she was quietly building her little web of connections in the back. Okay, she charmed and bullied her way into the whole city. From local doctors, nurses, cops, welfare workers, she pulled them in with bribes, political favors, anything that would make them say, yeah, okay, sure, whatever you say. But the biggest get was Judge Camille Kelly, the juvenile court judge. Once Georgia had her, it was basically game over for a lot of families. Kelly would rubber stamp custody transfers straight into Miss Georgia's hands, fast track style, sometimes with no real hearings and barely any paperwork. So families didn't even get a fair shot to fight back, and appealing it later was basically impossible. She had built this system that was working incredibly so in her favor. And once that whole machine was running, she started taking babies right out of hospitals. We need to take the child for medical care. We're just going to go do some tests. And then the kid would just not come back, ever. She pressured moms into signing stuff while they were still half out from anesthesia. And if anyone hesitated, she'd threaten them with legal trouble, like, you need to sign this or else. She also sent people into poor neighborhoods to scout shantytowns, playgrounds, wherever, basically, scouting for kids who looked like they didn't have much protection or oversight. The second a child seemed vulnerable or someone's guard was down, her spotters would call it in as a target. And all the paperwork for these kids was complete and total fiction. She was straight up making up new lives for these kids on paper. Like, she'd invent whole background stories about their families, saying, oh, they came from educated, stable, church-going parents, whatever would make them sound more desirable to wealthy adoptive families. There's money in these genes, babes. Birth certificates were rewritten, ages were tweaked, names swapped out. Once a kid went through her office, their identity basically became whatever Georgia says that it once was. By the mid-1930s, she had runners carrying like 4 to 6 babies at a time to places like New York and California every few weeks, handing them off to coastal elites, the wealthy couples in hotel rooms. And it's just insane to think about. She would basically charge travel expenses to all the couples, but deliver 6 babies in one trip and keep the travel fees for all 5 babies. You get what I mean? Inflated travel fees, okay? And those wealthy parents, especially the famous ones, were not exactly asking a ton of questions. They wanted a baby and they wanted discretion. She had both. End of story. Yeah. Celebs. Joan Crawford, for example, adopted her twin daughters through Georgia's baby brokerage. Yeah, Joan Crawford, the mommy dearest. Other Hollywood names like June Allison and Dick Powell went through the Memphis orphanage as well. Even Ric Flair. Yeah, the fucking wrestling legend Ric Flair was one of her processed infants. Her reach was everywhere and the money was flooding in. Babies made big bucks. Tennessee capped in-state adoption fees at $7, right? Pretty cheap. So Georgia just pivoted to out-of-state adoptions where she could charge up to $5,000 per kid. And that's like what? Like a 70,000% markup? And she kept most of that money. Reportedly up to 80 to 90% of each fee stashed in a secret account under a fake corporation. Just laundering babies for profit, basically. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, stuff inside her facility was getting darker and darker by the day. Infant death rates in the home were shooting up. During her peak years, Memphis ended up with the highest infant death rate in the country, which tells you everything you need to know about what was really going on behind that shiny children's charity front. Records described babies dropping like flies, some crammed 5 or 6 to a crib, drugged to stay quiet, left without real medical care, stuck in boiling rooms where a lot of them died. Doctors would give orders and staff would ignore them. Sick babies got left right next to healthy ones. And then in 1945, there was a dysentery outbreak that killed something like 40 to 50 infants in just a few months. And I'm sorry, it's cruelty. I can't even wrap my head around treating an infant like that. And somehow, because of course, most of these deaths didn't even set off alarms. Files were lost or forged. Babies who died were buried under these generic little first names like Baby Elizabeth, Baby Joseph, in an unmarked plot Georgia had bought at Elmwood Cemetery years earlier. A bunch of others were just never accounted for at all. Like, they just completely disappeared. But even with all that stacking up behind the scenes, she was thriving. And the wild part is that there were early obvious signs that should have stopped everything in its tracks. Families around Memphis started noticing their kids weren't coming back from quote-unquote temporary care. Mothers got told that their totally healthy newborns had died suddenly. Poor parents would be escorted out of hospitals by welfare workers and then hit with, oh, by the way, your baby's been committed to the state. Okay? They're not coming back. And every single time someone tried to push back, the same thing happened. Their complaints got buried in Judge Camille Kelly's courtroom. She was Georgia's ride or die baby. She wasn't giving up the gam. She would sign custody transfers in minutes if Georgia needed her to. Sometimes without hearings. Sometimes without the parents even there. And that gave Georgia legal cover to say that every child she grabbed was a quote-unquote ward of the state. And because Kelly was protected politically, even beloved, you might say, nobody wanted to ask why so many of her rulings just magically funneled kids straight into the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Meanwhile, Georgia's out here traveling the country giving speeches about the importance of adoption, acting like she was this big reformer, right? Selling a fantasy that she was rescuing poor kids from misery and delivering them to better futures. The press ate it up, celebrities ate it up, socialites ate it up. Everyone wanted a Georgia Tann baby. By the late 1940s, her operation was huge. She had nurses flying babies cross-country in the middle of the night, handing them off like packages. She ran Christmas baby giveaways. She made brochures that were basically catalogs of children, and she charged huge fees for home inspections and background checks that never even happened. She threatened adoptive parents if they got too curious. She'd repossess kids if people fell behind on payments. Like, this was a business, not a charity. This was like real life Cabbage Patch Kids, and she wasn't playing with her business model. But cult babes, the thing about building an empire on secrets is eventually somebody talks. By 1949, Tennessee politics had shifted. Boss Crump, a political kingmaker who'd protected her forever, lost his power grip when a new governor, Gordon Browning, came in. And suddenly all these people who had been ignored for years had someone who would actually listen to them. Rumors about missing kids, buried complaints, and all these unexplained deaths finally reached someone who wasn't in Georgia Tann's pocket. And that's when the walls started to come down. In September of 1950, Browning ordered a real investigation into the Tennessee Children's Home Society after so many complaints had piled in. Attorney Robert Taylor got assigned to dig through Georgia Tann's books, her methods, her political connections, and the trail of damage behind her. And it didn't take long to find thousands of files full of weirdness. Kids listed as orphans who, in fact, had living parents, money trails showing huge amounts flowing to Georgia, not the society. Babies who supposedly died but weren't anywhere in burial records. Healthy infants who died just after arriving. The list goes on. And then the big one. Proof that Judge Kelly had been illegally funneling kids to Georgia in exchange for favors and influence. Busted. On September 12th of 1950, Browning went public, and within 48 hours, it was national news. The angel of adoption was suddenly exposed as one of the biggest child traffickers in U.S. history. Everyone was like, get her ass. And then, the most infuriating anticlimax ever. 3 days later, Georgia Tann died. I know what you're thinking. I did too. Did she skirt? Nope. It was uterine cancer. Took her out right before she had to face a single charge, hearing, or consequence. The bitch got away with it. The Tennessee Children's Home Society got shut down. Judge Kelly quietly resigned, and a symbolic lawsuit was filed against Georgia's estate. But she basically took the truth and probably a ton of evidence to the grave with her. And then Tennessee did something that screwed her victims for the next half a century. They sealed the records. It's maddening. In 1951, the state passed adoption reforms that were supposedly about privacy, but what they really did was bury evidence, hide the trail, and make it almost impossible for adoptees or birth families to find each other. For decades, people begged for information and got told, sorry, no records, files sealed. Just dead end after dead end for many people for so long. And it wasn't really until the late 80s and 90s that the truth started breaking out for real, thanks to volunteer search groups, adoptee networks, genealogists, investigative journalists, historians, and survivors who just refused to shut up and go away. Little by little, stories bubbled up. Names got matched. Secrets started unraveling. Long-lost relatives were suddenly meeting each other in living rooms and airport terminals. Like, holy shit, this is real. TV shows put survivors on air. Books came out, like Barbara Raymond's The Baby Thief. And there's a more recent novel by Lisa Wingate that is based on the adoption ring as well. Lifetime and network TV made movies about it, like Stolen Babies, where Mary Tyler Moore played Georgia Tann and even won an Emmy for it. And then DNA testing shows up right a few years later and blows the whole thing up even more. Over the course of Georgia Tann's shady career running the Tennessee Children's Home Society between 1924 and 1950, she's estimated to have trafficked over 5,000 children, many to wealthy but very abusive homes. And at least an estimated 10% of those children died while in her custody. That's nearly 500 deaths. The blood on Georgia Tann's hands. It's an insane amount of kids and lives to ruin, and I'm sure there's still shit like this happening out here all the time. You could only hope that in this modern world, this modern society, that we see less and less of this. Especially the more people become aware and the more stories like this we hear. Now, I have to shout out a cult babe. Back in 2022, so like three years ago, over 3 years ago now, I got the following email. It says, quote, "Hi, love listening to your podcast. You absolutely crack me up with Madison on Obituary. Hi to her puppies and hi to Hot Dog." And now, since then, Frankie's here too. They're both curled up on the couch. I don't think you can see them though. Anyway, I love listening to Cult Leader. You have a way of telling these crimes. Thank you. When you think you've heard the worst, bam, you come up with another horrible crime or crazier crime. Anyway, I read a book a few years ago called Before We Were Yours. Not a true story, but also based on a true story that was happening. There's also a book about the evil lady called The Book Thief. Georgia Tann is her name. Awful. There are also movies on it if you don't want to read the book. I totally think you should cover it, but after you cover it, you're going to want to watch a Hallmark mushy movie because it's rough. I'll attach a couple pics. Stay awesome. And that was from a cult babe named Kimberly. Kimberly, thank you so much for sharing that story with me all those years ago. See, this is the thing. I'm always listening. I've got so much to talk to you guys about that we are, 7 years in, and we're only in 2022 right now. Thank you so much for sharing that case suggestion. If you guys have any stories, especially in the realm of adoption, I would like to hear them because I feel like it's not discussed a whole lot. And there's actually a lot of discourse in recent years about the adoption process, about being an adoptee and what that means in today's world, and the differences between trafficking and adoption, or like the web that sometimes unfortunately connects them, like in today's stories that we talked about. I would love to hear them. Spencer@cultleader.com is my email. And yeah, just an awful woman. You always hate when somebody dies before they even have to face the consequences for what they've done. But we can only hope she is rotting in eternal damnation. That is where we're going to leave things for the week. I will see you next time. And until next time, if somebody comes in and takes your baby, you better get some proof so you're not left with any maybes. Goodbye.